Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this BCCJ webinar, which is part of a series of webinars for members looking at the impact of COVID-19. Today, we're delighted to have the British Ambassador, His Excellency Paul Madden, who will give us an update and has kindly agreed to answer our questions as well. My name is Alison Beale, and I'm the Vice President of the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan, and I'm going to be moderating this session this morning. Today, we have a number of guests from the British Embassy who are on hand to help answer questions, and I'd like to introduce them now. We have Naomi Davies, Economic Counsellor, and thank you, Naomi, for your excellent moderation of the session yesterday on the impact on the global economy with speakers from Barclays and Standard Chartered. It was a really excellent session. We also have Chris Heffer, Minister-Counsellor and Director of Trade and Investment in Japan. Good morning, Chris. And we also have Matthew Phillips, Political Counsellor. Good morning, Matthew. But our guest speaker today is, of course, the Ambassador, Paul Madden. Ambassador, thank you very much for sparing your time today. And can I start by please asking you to give an update on where we are and the work that the Embassy has been doing in response to COVID-19?
Thank you. Well, good morning, Alison, and good morning, everyone. These are not the usual circumstances in which I meet members of the BCCJ, but I'd like to thank the Chamber for the initiative in hosting this, and you, Alison, for chairing it. So clearly, these are unprecedented times. I think all of us probably feel a mix of fear, frustration, and fatigue. Fear, perhaps, a bit for ourselves, but probably even more for vulnerable loved ones, particularly if they're on the other side of the world. Also fear about the long-term impact on our businesses and on our livelihoods. Also frustration that the conditions we're operating under now mean we can't get on with our business and personal lives in the way that we would like. And fatigue, wondering how long it's all going to last. Well, you don't need me to tell you that the situation in the UK, as in many other countries around the world, is really tough. There have been more than 124,000 cases and over 16,500 deaths. There is a very extensive lockdown affecting most people, and the government has introduced huge economic interventions. It looks like it's starting to work in terms of the slowing of the rate of increase of incidents. The NHS hasn't collapsed, but there will be significant economic impacts. I think the latest IMF predictions are that the UK's GDP will fall by 6.5% this year. Japan has a much lower incidence, but now Japan too has gone past 10,000 cases, some 238 deaths, and last week the state of emergency was extended across the whole country. An IMF prediction for the impact on Japan's economy is a fall by 5.2% this year. So I think governments everywhere are trying to find the right balance between health of their citizens and the economy. They're all listening to the experts. But the scale of what's happening is so immense and so unprecedented that even the experts sometimes have differing views, and they also have to change their views as circumstances change. So it's very easy to criticize what different governments are doing. But does anyone honestly think that every leader everywhere isn't trying to do their best in difficult circumstances? So a growing focus for many governments right now is how and when we will be able to start to transition out of the lockdowns to get economies going again without inviting a second wave of infections. I think many of you will know that the UK government has identified 5 tests for any decision to remove lockdown. But the reality is that for many vulnerable individuals, it's going to be quite a long haul. So let me talk about some of the things that the Embassy is doing. We're still operating, but many of our long-term events and projects have been cancelled or postponed. So, for example, big projects like the Olympics and the Paralympics and the Emperor's state visit to the UK have all been pushed into next year. More than 95% of our staff are now working from home. And actually, we're finding the technology works surprisingly well. So our top focus is consular work, which is all about protecting the health and safety of British nationals. You will recall that we had an early crisis to handle with the Diamond Princess cruise ship back in February, which seems an age ago now. The government has been strongly urging British travellers everywhere to go home while flights are still available, because we've been seeing all around the world commercial flights shrinking rapidly as tougher travel restrictions everywhere have massively reduced the number of people travelling. Now, at the moment, there are still direct flights to London with Jal and Anna, and a number of indirect flights available. We think that the number of British travellers who are still in the country has gone down from about 16,000 now to the hundreds. Many of my colleagues around the Asia-Pacific region have been involved in massive repatriation exercises, either because the volumes of British visitors in their countries is so huge, as in Australia, for example, or because the local medical systems are very fragile, as is the case in some Southeast Asian countries. So we don't have those kind of problems here. I think most long-term British residents in Japan are pretty resilient. Many of you have experienced major natural disasters before. The Japanese healthcare system is sophisticated and well respected. So our principal focus on our consular work now is to make sure that we put out the most up-to-date information on our social media so that you can all take informed decisions, and also to help the relatively small number of particularly vulnerable groups who may face specific difficulties. Another focus for the embassy has been around business. For example, helping the NHS access equipment and supplies through supply chains in Japan and around the region. And maybe Chris Heffer will be able to say something about that later on. We've also been reaching out to reassure Japanese investors in the UK and to support British companies here. I know, for example, that some BCCJ members, and particularly smaller ones, are keen to understand the Japanese government's support measures for business. A third area for our activity is about providing information back to the UK about Japanese policies on COVID-19 and to understand the science and other factors that lie behind their decisions, help to bring experts together as governments in the major economies exchange experiences and ideas. And the final area is supporting the work that Britain and Japan do together through international organizations like G7, G20, World Health Organization, to work on the global response, and particularly in helping the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable countries in regions like Africa, for example. Both Britain and Japan have major aid programs and are very significant contributors to international organizations like the WHO and global initiatives like CEPI and Gavi. And both countries have recently announced significant new support for those organizations. So I think that's all I had to say by way of introduction. I and my colleagues will be very happy to take any questions that you may have. We may not always know the answers to them, but we'll try to tell you what we know. But I don't want it just to be a Q&A, because I think part of the value of an exercise like this for us is to hear the thoughts that you have about COVID-19, how it's affecting your businesses, how it's affecting your lives here in Japan. And we'll very much take away any comments that you make in the course of this session. Thanks, Alison.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. And we'll move on to questions and answers in a minute, and I can already see some coming in. So if I could encourage participants to send their questions through the Q&A function. I'd like to first of all just pick up on something you said about the impact on business. Obviously there's going to be a huge economic fallout and great impact on British businesses here in Japan. So how is the embassy engaging with businesses at the moment?
So my team have reached out to talk to many businesses. I've talked to a number of CEOs myself to talk about what the impact is on their current operations, to talk about how it's impacting their staff. and also to talk about what support they might want to see now and in the future as we move out of the state of crisis. But I think that's something that I might want to bring Chris Heffer to talk on.
Morning all, sorry, rapidly hitting unmute here. Thank you, Paul. I think, as you say, we've done a variety of things to support British businesses here in Japan. You hosted a webinar, as you said, with a number of large companies last week just to see how they're doing, and we reached out and phoned them all personally. Clearly, economically, businesses are very different places. Some are seeing a shortfall from customers, from orders. Some are seeing business actually kind of focus fine. Some are seeing visa issues as the borders shut down. And those businesses, say with the Olympics, are obviously looking at what does the postponement mean, and we've been in touch with all of those. So I think those that are here, we've reached out to. A number of asked for help in a few places. We had quite a conversation about changing working practices. I'm sure we'll come back to remote working and what that's doing for us all. But some companies raising issues of, can I get digital signatures? So actually, how do we change processes here in Japan to do things better? I guess the companies we're not seeing so much as we normally would are British exporters trying to get a foot in the British market. That has largely dried up. We're doing 2 or 3 bits of work for those sorts of companies. I don't know what the time horizons will be. I'm sure we'll come back to kind of what the future looks like for those. A large part of business in Japan is face-to-face. A large part of exports is coming to the market and seeing those people. A large part is coming to trade fairs. And those have clearly dried up for the short run. And who knows what the medium or long run will have. I think, again, we'll come back to this. It's an opportunity to say, what can we do differently? How do you run more digital seminars such as this? How do you do digital pitching sessions? And we're hoping to do a second one of those around fintech quite soon in the next kind of couple of months. So I think we're seeing those that are here. We're reaching out to those that we would normally see that kind of aren't here. And I guess part of today is an offer of help for those to say, what help do you need from the British Embassy? And we're here to help where we can.
That's great, thank you. And we all appreciate that very much. The Japanese government recently announced a package of financial support for businesses. Do you have any details about that, and will British businesses be eligible?
So there are 2 elements to the financial support. There is financial support to individuals, which was initially going to be targeted just on households, and particularly vulnerable households. It's now been extended to all citizens and residents who are registered. So I think some Brits here may be eligible for that too. And then there is support which is available to the corporate sector. A lot of the details of that are still relatively unclear and being worked through. But I'll bring Naomi in here, who can talk about the sort of big picture of some of the volumes involved, for example.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, in terms of money going to SMEs, sort of recently announced as part of the new draft budget is, I think, 2.3 trillion yen going towards SMEs, sort of cash payments to a variety of different businesses. So up to 2 million yen to corporations and 1 million yen to sole proprietors whose revenues fall by more than 50% in any month of 2020 compared to the previous year. There's also a wide variety of no or very low interest, no collateral loans that have been made available with principal amortization deferred for up to 5 years. That's mostly, I think, through private financial institutions as well as through the government affiliated financial institutions such as the Japan Finance Corporation. There's also been a wide variety of sort of tax measures and deferral of taxes, as well as general requests to landlords to consider rent deferment depending on tenant situation. So that's mostly focused on the business tenants. So hopefully that is a useful summary of some of the SME measures. There's also the wage subsidies that are available to both SMEs as well as to larger corporations. I think that is, I'm trying to remember my figures now, I think it's up to 90% for SMEs and up to, I want to say 75%, but I might have got my figures wrong, for larger corporations on the assumption that no one is made unemployed from those firms. So there are a variety of different subsidies and assistance available to companies of different sizes. Hopefully that's a useful starter in terms of the access or the availability of items, and they are actually available to UK firms who've got the correct registration in Japan. So for example, if you have employees in Japan and are paying into the employee insurance scheme that's run by the government, then British firms are eligible.
Great, thank you. And I'd also like to ask a little bit about well-being, because in your introduction you talked about our health and our feelings of fear, frustration, fatigue. Can you expand a little bit on the impact on people's well-being and any support that might be available?
Sure. Well, just to describe in terms of what we're doing at the embassy, I said at the beginning, more than 95% of our staff are working from home. Actually, as a good employer, we've always encouraged people to work from home when it suits them. And we have technology which is able to support that. And it's actually stood up quite well to very large numbers of people doing that. I think one thing that's important is to remember that everyone's got very different circumstances at home. So we're very conscious that when we're talking to some of our local colleagues, particularly who are dialing in, that they may be working out of relatively small apartments, which they're also sharing with spouses who are trying to work from home, and with children, and in some cases elderly relatives as well. So quite a lot of pressures on them. We've introduced some specific wellbeing support initiatives for our staff, including things like buddy schemes, including opportunities for people to chat regularly, share each other's problems and tips about working from home. While some people are particularly busy on some of the ongoing work that I described earlier, there are others whose normal work might be delivering events who are less actively involved in some of the things we're doing now. But to make sure that everyone is involved, we have regular call-ins when people can learn about all the things that the embassy is focused on, and when people can raise any issues they may have. And so from my conversations with some of the major UK employers here, I think a lot of those are doing rather similar things in their organisations.
That's great, thank you. I'd like to move over now to questions and answers, because we have a huge number of questions coming in. So first of all, somebody has asked, is there anything that UK companies here in Japan can do to support the COVID-19 response in Japan?
So I know that a number of companies are very involved because their products or services are very relevant. Obviously, we have some major pharma companies located in Japan who are quite actively involved in all of this. I know that some consumer goods companies have been involved in putting on the market more sanitation products. And so some of those are very directly involved. I guess others are looking for ways to provide support. For example, I think the hotel sector has opportunities to, which is obviously very depressed at the moment, has some opportunities to engage with the Japanese government in providing accommodation for those people who have tested positive, but are not yet at the stage where they need to go into hospital for intensive care. So I think there are a whole range of things that people can do as a natural part of their business. But I know that some companies are also thinking about what they can do outside of their regular business, or using any spare capacity that their employees may have to help on a voluntary basis. So, for example, in the UK, the National Health Service called for volunteers to help with their work. And I think they were looking for a couple of 100,000. They had 750,000 people volunteering. I think there is a huge willingness of ordinary people to engage and help their fellow citizens at these difficult times.
Right. We have a question here from Kirsten O'Connor, who's asking, do you have any sense of when British nationals with permanent residency will be able to travel smoothly visa-wise between Japan and the UK? And especially those maybe in the LGBT community whose marriage to Japanese nationals is not recognised here in Japan?
So I'll answer on the general points, but I'll then bring Matthew Phillips in, who is our counsellor political, but has been following the consular issues very closely. So at the moment, the Japanese government announced that as of the 3rd of April, any non-Japanese national who'd been in the UK or a very large range of other countries in the past 2 weeks is not able to enter Japan except in some exceptional circumstances. And those exceptions are permanent residents, long-term residents, their spouses and family members, and the spouse and family of Japanese nationals. But anyone who has left Japan after the 3rd of April will not be allowed to return. So I think people have had to make some quite difficult decisions, because very often deciding to move somewhere means that you are committing yourself to stay in that place for quite some time, potentially. Matthew, do you want to come in on more of the details on Kirsten's particular point?
Sure, thanks, Paul. I mean, I think you set out the situation as it is at the moment. As I say, there are a number of, it's extremely difficult now for Brits to return to Japan. The kind of wider question about when those restrictions will be lifted, I'd like to offer an answer, but I think at this time it's still too difficult to tell. Like you, I think we're watching that very closely. I think initially Japan had planned to ensure that such measures were in place until the end of April. Clearly, with the state of emergency going beyond that, I suspect it may be a little bit longer. But we will, of course, update travel advice and social media as soon as we have more information on that.
Great. So we have a question here from David Bickle, who asks, how will UK government policy priorities be impacted as a result of COVID-19? And what will it focus on differently over the next 2 to 3 years when the country is hopefully in post-COVID-19 recovery phase? And David doesn't mention this, and I hate to add to people's emotional distress, but if I could just ask about Brexit and any implications on trade negotiations going forward.
Sure, and obviously, as I said right at the start, we're in really unprecedented circumstances now. We're dealing with a major global health challenge, and even when we start to get on top of that and emerge from it, the economic measures that people have had to take around the world will have a really significant impact, both on global economy and on individual countries' economies. And so that is going to be a really important challenge as we come out from it. In terms of what its impact on a whole range of policies, it's going to be very hard to say, but it's clearly going to be the big focus for governments everywhere in the next couple of years. Specifically around Brexit, the government is still absolutely committed that, as you know, we left the EU at the end of January. We're currently in a transition period to the end of this year, in the course of which the international agreements which the EU has with countries like Japan will continue to apply. But from the 31st of December, that will come to an end, and that's why we've been working to put in place specific new bilateral arrangements with Japan. Obviously, there has been some impact on the frequency with which we can have those free trade arrangement negotiations. We would like to have been in full negotiating mode by now. That hasn't been able to happen, but individuals have had some informal contacts. And in terms of the UK's negotiations with the EU, as you may know, in fact, some of the lead negotiators on both sides actually came down with COVID-19 themselves, but seem to have recovered. And they are now moving ahead. I think they've just published some dates for a series of further rounds of negotiations, and so the government's commitment to the end of the year deadline remains in place.
If I can just pick up a little bit on that, I think a defining moment of this crisis was when the Prime Minister was taken into the ICU, and of course now he's recovering, and the Foreign Secretary is deputising, who I think is probably a little bit of a lesser well-known figure for a lot of people. Do you have any insights into the extent to which the British government is functioning smoothly at the moment?
Well, of course, as an official of Her Majesty's government, it always functions smoothly. I think, yes, I think all around the world there was a lot of attention on the fact that someone as well-known a figure and someone who plays such a leading role as the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the fact that he should get it, I think, was quite a shock to people. I know for my own kids who are in their 20s, they were very shocked when they heard that our Prime Minister contracted the virus, because, you know, for them, it's a kind of immutable fact of life that you have a Prime Minister and that he's running the country and so on. I mean, of course, as many commentators pointed out, in the UK, we have a parliamentary cabinet-based system, not a presidential system. So business does go on when a prime minister is incapacitated. Measures were put in place. Dominic Raab, the foreign secretary, who some of you may have met because he was here in February, actually staying in this house where I am now, eating breakfast, I think, at this table where I'm sitting right now. So he has been getting on with delivering the business of the country, and it's largely been continuing along the lines which had been set out by Boris Johnson before he was ill. Now that Boris Johnson seems to have recovered from the worst of it, but is still obviously going to be recuperating for several weeks, I understand that he is back in regular contact now with his cabinet colleagues, and business carries on. There have been a number of changes to the way the government works. For a start, a lot of people are working from home all across Whitehall. The number of issues that people are able to focus on has been really narrowed down to focusing a lot of things around COVID-19, the healthcare response and the economic response. That's obviously the top priority for the government. And there's been a lot of engagement with experts, whether they're healthcare experts, infectious diseases scientists, and you will have seen that on the regular daily press conferences that come out of Number 10, whichever cabinet minister is speaking is usually flanked by scientific and medical advisors, because the government attach a lot of importance to ensuring that they're always acting on the best scientific and expert advice and evidence. Thanks.
Thank you. Just one more question on the economic implications before we move on to some other subjects, and we've got a great number of questions coming in. But another question from David is, will a post-COVID-19 realignment of global supply chains be an opportunity or a threat to the UK?
That's a good question, and I'll let Chris come in with his two penneth too. I think one of the things that I've heard a lot of people here in Japan saying is that this has probably accentuated a trend which was already beginning to take place for a number of reasons, of people wanting to reduce their levels of reliance on China in the supply chains. I mean, of course, given the scale of the Chinese economy, it's going to be a very important factor in the supply chains for many businesses and many countries. But already, I think we were starting to see, as China's cost base had increased, that many companies were taking decisions to diversify towards some lower cost locations in Southeast Asia, for example. And I think we're probably going to see more of that happening. But I think overall, one thing that really this crisis has shown is how interconnected we are in the modern world. And you know, a small plant in one country providing key components can bring whole industries grinding to a halt for short periods until replacements are found. So maybe there will be pressure for a lot of businesses to rethink issues like resilience in the face of the impacts that they see from a global pandemic. Chris, I don't know if you want to come in with any thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, just a couple, as you say. I mean, businesses have long focused on supply chain transparency, often for issues around sort of bribery, corruption, and child slave labour. So that as a focus has been quite growing recently. I think you're right. The keyword resilience is probably now going to come back into British thinking in a way it probably hasn't been. Companies in this part of the world actually are used to coping with natural disasters. And we've had floods in Japan that have shut down parts of Toyota's supply chain. I think companies have diversified off the back of that. Probably a concept that's not really bedded down in the British thinking kind of fully yet. There's a lot of interest in the British government at the moment on the current Japanese policy around supply chains. I think it's quite an emerging policy, the sort of $2 billion fund for shifting supply chains. I don't think it names China, but it does sort of say returning or from one country. And it's a trend we've already seen happening anyway. So arguably what impact that has, whether that's a political and economic, and what that means for ASEAN. So I think this part of the world is quite in focus in London for how it's responding and how governments put money behind some of those sorts of efforts. So I think it will grow. I think there's an interesting balance between sort of nationalism and free trade in that. I think Britain will always want to be pro-free trade, whilst work with us to say, how do you secure appropriate supply chains? You talked a bit about the NHS supplies, which I think has brought this into kind of quite stark relief. And Britain's been focusing on sort of 4 areas for equipment, as has the rest of the world, kind of in order: ventilators, as people hit the peaks in different parts of the world. PPE is a large focus for many countries, and that's quite an ongoing need. People are looking at testing kits as you start to think of a way out of this crisis. It's quite big in London. And then you move on to sort of medicines and vaccines for the kind of answer to that. And whilst we've seen cooperation at a global level on many of those areas, science is global, research is global, vaccine solution will inevitably be global. There's been a slightly unseemly probably fight for PPE around the world, in different countries acting quite different ways. Britain's been pretty ethical about how it does that. You see on the ventilator challenge an amazing response to British industry in the UK, and a number of companies, I think some on this call probably today, as part of that in the UK. Britain's got an amazing sort of rapid prototyping development capability, often built around the F1 and some amazing innovative companies. That said, you can only do that so fast, and you're still reliant on some parts manufacturers. And actually, Japan's been quite a critical part of the supply chain for some quite specialist components we've seen. That ventilator companies have come together, but so you still need some stuff that you can't make that quickly, and Japan's been an important part of that. So the supply chains are quite deep. I'm sure Britain will be quite well placed to work out the opportunities in the future off the back of that.
Thank you. We have a question that's come in, and I think this is really the million-dollar question, is where do you think the COVID-19 situation is heading in Japan? And in particular with reference to the figures being very low by any measure. For example, 263 deaths compared to 16,500 in the UK. And it seems that the statistics maybe don't seem to match with the rhetoric in the media about hospitals, etc., being under serious strain. Do you have any insights into this?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not really the job of a foreign embassy to give a sort of running commentary on the policies of another government. I mean, every government has to deal with the situation it finds. Every government is trying to make the right sort of judgments about how they balance the healthcare interest. They need to protect the welfare of their people and also protect the integrity of their healthcare systems, with the economic impact on jobs, and also with what is acceptable to their publics, and that will range from country to country as well. So I think that, you know, if you look at some of the recent media commentary following the extension of the state of emergency at the end of last week, there was some criticism of Prime Minister Abe that he didn't act soon enough or go far enough, and other criticism from other sides that he'd gone too far and too soon. So I think that just indicates that for governments, it is a very difficult challenge, but I think governments are always looking to the best expertise they can find from scientists, healthcare professionals and economists. And I think that's what Japan has been trying to do.
Do you have any, I appreciate that it's maybe not your position to comment, but do you have any ideas, for example, on areas where you think Japan could maybe learn from the UK's response? And also conversely, where Japan can learn from how the UK can learn from how Japan has handled the situation? Are there any learning points on both sides?
So I guess the UK is obviously further ahead on the curve in terms of the number of infections and the number of deaths. And it remains to be seen whether Japan will move up that curve as far as the UK and many European countries have done. I mean, let's hope it doesn't. And so no doubt they will be watching how the UK and other European countries have implemented lockdowns and so on. I think there's also some learning from the West about some of the cultural factors, which a lot of people have been talking about around Japan, but also some other Asian countries, which might explain lower levels of spread in some of those countries. If you look at neighboring Korea and Taiwan, for example, so the spread has been controlled pretty well. And some of the cultural factors people often refer to are the fact that, for example, Japanese and many other Asians are less touchy than Westerners. They tend to bow rather than shaking hands, touching each other, kissing each other. That also there is a strong focus on personal hygiene, on very regular hand washing, and on the fact that Japanese, for example, have a very high propensity in normal times to wear face masks when they have a cold, both out of public spiritedness, not wanting to spread it to others, but also as a means of protection. So maybe some of those factors are also in the mix as well.
So we've got a huge range of other questions coming in. So quickly, the next one. What do you think about the future of the EU after post-COVID-19?
Well, of course, I have less need to comment on it now than I would have done before the end of January, since it will be an organisation which is a neighbour rather than one of which we are a member. Clearly, in the course of the developments of COVID-19, which have impacted on different countries in different ways, there has sometimes been a temptation for some countries to act very directly in their national interest, and maybe in a way that hasn't always been thought of as completely in the communautaire spirit that maybe Brussels would have expected. I think that's probably quite a natural instinct that national governments responding to the needs and wishes of their citizens will follow. But I think as the crisis has proceeded, I think we've seen growing coordination between the EU around both health and science responses, but also around economic and financial coordination too. So, you know, who knows exactly what the long-term implications of all of this are going to mean for any of us. But I think generally, I think it demonstrates that not just in normal times, but in times of crisis, governments, particularly national governments, have to be really responsive to the direct needs and wishes of their citizens.
We have a question here. Do you know if there are any appeals to encourage the Japanese national government to instruct hospitals across the country to recognise, for example, common law relationships and also ward-level same-sex marriage registrations, so that non-legally married but recognised couples will be recognised as family members and thus allowed to receive information about the health and status of spouses under medical care? I guess this is particularly critical in this period of crisis.
So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I'll ask Matthew if he knows any more about it, but if he doesn't, it's something we'll take away and investigate.
Thanks, Paul. No, it's not something that we've been tracking that closely to date, but absolutely something we can pick up with the Japanese authorities.
That would be great. I think many of us would appreciate that. Do you see the lack of manufacturing capacity in the UK as a potential strategic weakness? And thank you, David Syrad, for your question. Yeah.
I'll bring Chris in on that one as well in a moment. You know, most countries play to their economic strength. The UK has, well, I should start by saying actually the UK still has more manufacturing than it's sometimes given credit for. We have some really significant companies who are world-class in some important sectors, pharma, you look at aerospace, for example, and a number of other areas, ICT and so on. So it's not that we've completely exited manufacturing, but services, and particularly financial services, have assumed a really important role in the UK economy, and that part of that is driven by the competitiveness of the City of London as a global financial hub. And for a long time, our resilience has been thought of in terms of our access to global markets and normally in global supply chains. And in the normal course of events, that has proved a pretty correct approach. Clearly, we're in a really difficult and different situation in a place where we have a global pandemic, where global supply chains are so massively disrupted. But I think as we move back into a more normal situation again, the government will be pressing for continued emphasis on keeping markets open, on free trade, on resisting protection, so that we can have these diverse sources of supply again. I'll bring in Chris on that, and I don't know if Naomi's our professional economist, our economic counsellor, and she may want to say something on that too. Chris.
Probably just two things. I think always disagree with the premise of the question is always a good one. So actually Britain still has, I think, 10% of the economy is manufacturing, 50% of our exports still. So I think we have a strong and thriving manufacturing sector. David, I know you're a key part of keeping that going, so thank you very much. I guess I was just going to link back to one of the earlier questions around kind of future policies of the UK government. And I mean, we get little sort of drips from that, from the number 10 kind of central thinking, and clearly you're coping with a crisis right now. There's thoughts about what's the exit strategy, if that's the right term. There are bits of thoughts about, rather than just take this as one problem to be solved, how do you actually tackle the other issues that are still there in the global and UK economy? Whether that's inequality between different social classes or regions, whether that's issues around green recovery, so a shift to a low carbon environment. And I think the UK tendency will be to say, how do we also deliver on those whilst exiting the COVID response? So actually, how do you revive a manufacturing base for the future in the right parts of the world with the right skills, and do that as part of our response? The UK government, I'm getting ahead of Naomi's economists, clearly take an extraordinary position in the amount of money it's now putting, in a sense, the amount of the economy it now underwrites. As a part of it might say, well, keep going and keep tackling some of these big issues that have been there long standing. But I'll hand over to the economist at that point. Naomi.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Paul. So I guess actually that the key word that I want to focus on in all of this is diversification, and so diversification of supply chains. So people have been talking globally about bringing supply chains for a variety of different goods and items back to the domestic, wherever the domestic is, whether it's in the US, UK, Japan. And I can understand why there is a very strong focus on that at the moment. But as an economist, I would emphasise the importance of diversification of supply and of access to goods. Because if you have a major domestic issue, so for example, if you're trying to bring back a lot of your food supply chains to be domestic, and then you have a floods or a drought or the such like, then actually you're in a weaker position than you would be if you had a diverse supply across the world. So I think it is diversity and diversification of supply chains is the real important point, and actually the UK certainly has a role to play on that, in food, in manufacturing, in services of all types. So yeah, I think I just want to focus on diversification being more important than necessarily bringing things back to a domestic point. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I move on to a slightly different subject here, which is how the crisis will affect the UK, or has affected the UK-Japan season of culture. And many of us, I know that the British Council was planning many great activities. Many of us were looking forward to seeing the National Gallery exhibition. So how will this crisis affect cultural, educational, scientific links, and in particular the UK-Japan season of culture?
Yes, it's really unfortunate. As you say, we had a great programme of events ranging from huge British cultural icons like the National Gallery and the LSO and the Royal Shakespeare Company and so on. And all of those which were due to take place so far have all been either cancelled or postponed because they're caught up in the restrictions on large public gatherings. So, for example, the National Gallery exhibition had arrived, was hung in Ueno, and was just not able to be open to the public, which is a great shame. I know we're looking at some alternatives to see what we can do to bring to the public, some at least perhaps using video technology, some representations digitally of what they might have been able to see and enjoy. But it is a great shame. We will look at what we can salvage from it. So obviously things that are due to take place as part of that in the autumn. As of yet, we haven't had decisions to cancel or postpone all of those. And so that will depend on the progress that takes place with the spread of the control of the infection by then. We've also been discussing with our major corporate sponsors, putting it on a hold. So in some cases, we haven't drawn down all those financial commitments yet from them, and they remain in reserve to be able to gear up again. Also conscious that a big part of the shaping of the year of the UK in Japan was around the Olympics and Paralympics, which have themselves been shunted a year to the right to next summer. So we will be looking at what we'll be able to do. Chris, do you want to add anything to that? Because you've been one of the leaders on this exercise.
Just one thing, I'm glad you used the word salvage. So I think there's quite an emotional response to something that is now no longer going ahead in the way you planned to. And we sort of mourned, if that's the right word, over that. I think actually we're in a slight spirit of, well, what can you continue and what can you do differently? I don't think we've got any answers on that, but there's a slight positivity across a range of fronts of saying, well, how would you do a digital Great Week? How do we bring the best of the National Gallery to people in a digital environment? And how might you do this differently? So I think we welcome ideas as people get back on that journey, recognise there's a slight emotional as we go through that. And I think we're looking for ways to show the best of Britain here in Japan. I see Japan has just tweeted today about the kind of Cool Japan exhibition in the UK now going digital. So Japan in the Cloud, I think it's called. So I think we're heading that way. I'm not sure what reality or real life will ever look, and maybe we're in it for a digital world for a long while, but I think we'll look to continue in the best ways we can.
Thank you. So moving on to another subject. So this is a global pandemic and requires an international and coordinated response. We've got a question here from the K group, which is, Brexit aside, is the UK still collaborating with the UK, and if so, in which areas? And maybe to add on to that a little bit, is there anything more you could add about specific ways in which the UK and Japan are collaborating and working together in this crisis?
So the first question was about collaborating with the EU, I think. Yeah. So we've always said that we will still work closely with the EU, where it's in our national sovereign interest to do so, but the difference is we'll be doing it as a sovereign nation. And so one very good example of that is the global response to the challenges of climate change. And the UK was due to host a big conference in November in Glasgow, the COP, the Conference of Parties. We were co-hosting that with Italy, but it was going to take place in the UK. And that's an area where there's a very large measure of agreement between the UK and other EU partners about the commitments that countries need to make to bringing down their emissions, to the long-term goals they set themselves, and to the assistance for other countries, particularly countries which are very vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And so that's an area where we have been working very closely together. That conference has now been postponed until next year, like many things, but we'll continue to work on that. We see Japan as an important potential partner in this area too. We've said publicly that we'd like to see a bit more ambition from Japan on climate change. It recently announced its NDCs, its short-term commitments, which are for emissions reduction, which are essentially a restatement of its current level of commitments, and we would have liked it to go further, and many countries have said that. But I think perhaps the fact that the big conference has been postponed gives more countries a chance to work on their programs for levels of ambition. So I think that's just one example of a big global challenge where we will continue to work closely with the EU, and where we'll also work closely with Japan. And there are many other challenges that we're working with Japan too. And the UK government, through its industrial strategy, set out a number of big challenges that many developed countries face, and they were going to be drawn out in some of the elements of our Year of UK and Japan through a series of Great Weeks. And they include things like how we tackle some of the problems of aging societies, what we do about the future of mobility, which is changing vastly. And so these are other areas where we think Japan and the UK both have a common set of challenges that we face, because we're rather similar economies, but also have opportunities to work together on the solutions to some of those challenges.
Thank you. I've got another question here from David Bickle, who's asked, When the embassy promotes the UK and Japan going forwards, what stories will you draw on from the UK's response to COVID-19 that will help you reinforce your positive messages?
I think it's, they say journalists get to write the first draft of history. I think it's probably too early for me to be talking midway through a crisis to what stories we will draw out. When I first came here, a lot of people talked to me about some of the stories that came out of the 2011 tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear crisis. And one of the stories that was very prevalent then was that Brits, British citizens, British government, British businesses in Japan were pretty resilient. They stayed when others rushed for the door. That our government responses were very focused on evidence-based, science-based decision-making, and I think that was respected. And I hope that we will emerge from this current crisis with a rather similar image.
Thank you, hope so. And we've just received a reminder from Custom Media that if Britons in Japan would like to share their COVID-19 anecdotes or photos or initiatives to help the UK community in Japan, then please contact Acumen so that they can highlight them in an upcoming issue of the magazine. So thank you. And we're really running short of time, so I think maybe just one more question close to my heart. UK research excellence is being profiled globally thanks to its contributions to the fight against COVID-19. What more can be done to promote university and educational collaboration between institutions in the UK and Japan?
So this is an area that my science and innovation team at the embassy have been putting a lot of effort into. The quality of collaboration between UK science and Japanese science is very high, and you can measure that in various ways, but one of the measures they use as a proxy is the extent to which joint research collaborations are cited in the global literature. And UK-Japan collaboration always scores really highly on that. So the quality is great, but we'd like to see much more in terms of the quantity. And we've seen some improvements on that in the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen a new ability, for example, for institutions in both countries to make common bids into joint funding exercises. So we're hoping to see that grow. And we're very conscious that as we look at the way the science community is responding to the current crisis, it's building on many existing links. I mean, the whole field of life sciences and medical science particularly is one of the closest areas in which UK and Japanese institutions have been working together. One of the reasons that some of the big Japanese pharma companies have established in the UK, and not just plants, but research facilities, is because of the relationships which they have with some of the UK's leading universities. And I think this crisis has been an opportunity to build on that even further.
So finally, I think I'd like to finish with the last question, which I think is probably from the youngest participant on this webinar, Louis, who's watching this with his dad. He's aged 6. And he would like to ask, when do you think we'll be able to visit England this summer? And Louis in particular wants to go to Legoland. So any insights into that?
Yeah, actually I live quite not far from Legoland when I'm back in the UK. So I hope you do get a chance to go there soon. It's really too early to predict what is going to be possible in terms of movements this summer, because it will depend on a whole range of factors. It will depend on the travel restrictions imposed by different countries, and it will depend on what airlines are doing in terms of what flights are available. So, I think everyone wants to get out of the current situation as soon as it's medically safe to do so, and to restore normal life to the maximum extent possible. Whether it's this summer or not, who knows? If you're 6 years old, I would say you will have lots of opportunities ahead of you to get to Legoland and many of the other fantastic places to visit in the UK. Can I say something, as this is more or less at the end of the session, Alison? I just want to say, if there's any sort of silver cloud coming out of what are pretty dark times all around the world, I think it's been this huge outpouring of kindness in lots of ways. So first of all, I think the extraordinary response of healthcare workers, the caring professions throughout this crisis, people who go in and risk their lives on a daily basis, and their dedication has been really extraordinary. And we've seen in the UK, the response to that from the public has been this really heartening reaction of people standing outside their doors on a Thursday evening and clapping and applauding for it's called Clap for Our Carers, because it's not just the medical professionals, but it's all the support staff too. It's the cleaners, often doing unglamorous, not very well paid jobs, but who also go in and do really important jobs, workers in care homes, for example. So those kinds of kindness, but also lots of individual areas of kindness. I was struck that my 91-year-old father, who's stranded at home with this crisis, told me that a random person came around and mowed his lawns last week. The man said that he was normally a cook working in a restaurant. His restaurant was closed, so he was just looking for things to do to help people. He didn't want to be paid. He was just trying to help out. And I think also just in the way that all of us are relating to each other, I think people are just being nicer to each other. And that's a pretty good thing. And I hope some of that will be retained when we get back to the sort of buzz and hubbub of our everyday lives afterwards.
That's a very good point, and thank you for mentioning that. I'd like to apologise to anyone who's asked a question who we haven't had time to answer, but I think that's a great message for us to end this webinar on, to remember the kind of kindness and compassion in our societies and commit together to hold on to these attributes going forward. So thank you everyone for today. It's been a really excellent and informative session. I know all the members of the audience will join me in thanking our speakers from the Embassy today, the Ambassador, Paul Madden, Naomi Davies, Chris Heffer, Matthew Phillips. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Thank you also to everyone who's tuned into this webinar. We have many other webinars planned, so please keep an eye on our website. And we'd also love to hear from you about any topics or speakers that you'd like us to cover. So in the meantime, thank you all for tuning in. Please stay safe, healthy, kind and compassionate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.